Last week, I asked for your MCU hot takes, and you shared over 1,000 of your most controversial MCU opinions. And when I shot this video, I accidentally wanted to fight with you way too much, and it went way too long. And in the editing, I realized this is not one video, this is 2 videos worth of fighting over the MCU. So let's dive into part 2. Let's fight. What did people have to say about Endgame? Endgame is the worst movie in the MCU.
How dare you!
And one of the worst cinecomics of all time. One of the worst scripts of all time as well. Sounds to me like you haven't seen very many movies. If you think this is one of the worst of all time, let me tell you, there's some really, really bad movies out there.
It's worse. It's so much worse.
I don't know. This feels a little bit like someone just trying to write something extreme to get included, but there's no argument actually made. It's just hyperbole. So tough to take it too seriously and tough to rebut it when it just feels like saying something extreme just to get my attention, which you did. Next one on here, my hot take. Endgame is actually a very bad movie that is saved by an amazing final battle. Everything besides that is awful. Awful? That feels way overstated. And a pretty common take is Endgame is overrated, and it's kind of a dull first 2 hours and a fantastic final hour. Or the last hour is so rewatchable, but, you know, it's kind of a bit of a drag to get through the first 2 acts of it. I would strongly argue the first hour of this movie is one of the more interesting and mature hours of an MCU film, because it's essentially watching each of our core Avengers dealing with tragedy. How do each of them deal with extraordinary loss? And you see these different paths of some people dive into their work, and they pour into other people to help the other people who are hurting. Tony escapes. Hulk tries to fix himself and change himself. Thor turns into an SNL parody of himself. But it kind of has this exploration of how these characters we've spent all this time with deal with loss and tragedy. That's a very mature subject for a movie that is famous for its fan service third act, where, you know, Captain America has Mjolnir, and you're exploring it for a long time, and you kind of soak in the fact that the apocalypse happened. So I would kind of strongly disagree with the idea that everything else is awful. I feel that's wildly overstated. Now, when you get into the middle act, you know, maybe it's, you know, we're touching back, spending a little bit too much time in previous movies, but it's kind of interesting. And if you're closing out this saga of 22 films and you kind of bookend it, reminding us of previous movies in a way that actually makes sense with what they're doing in the context of the plot, I think it works.
And now, looking back on it, I just remember the good stuff.
I think there's a lot more to this movie than just the third act. And I think people even kind of get confused because as to what they're experiencing. Because some movies are very rewatchable because they're very easy to watch, and other movies are great but not very rewatchable. Schindler's List, fantastic film. I don't throw it on like a Friday night because I just, you know, want some easy watching. I've seen it like 3 times in my life, spanning 30 years, because it's a tough watch, but a great film. Other movies aren't great, but they're super digestible and watchable. And I think you get a bit of both of those experiences in this movie. The first hour is not the most rewatchable hour of the MCU because you're dealing with the apocalypse and tragedy and trauma. And then the last hour, it's all highly rewatchable popcorn entertainment that's so fun and satisfying. But they're both in the same movie. So one part of the movie is highly rewatchable and one part isn't nearly as rewatchable. And so you can misjudge the first part of the movie in light of the second half when it's not really a matter of quality at all. Avengers Assemble is the worst MCU product by far. That's right, Worse than She-Hulk. No, this is truly a hot take, because most of these other ones above us, they were hot takes, but other people said something in the same ballpark. There's at least a little club of people sharing the No Way Home, Endgame, or Overrated, they suck club, whatever it is. But I didn't see like anyone else that decided to like single out Avengers Assemble, or the Avengers as it's called here in the United States, single that one out to be like, this is the single worst MCU product. You are alone with that flaming hot take. All right, we got a bunch of comments on Thor Ragnarok. Thor Ragnarok is one of the worst MCU movies. It doesn't take its story serious enough. It disrespects characters from past Thor movies. Rather than being a satisfying Thor experience, it leans on humor way too much. Thor Ragnarok is the most overrated MCU film. The humor is different, but it feels like an attempt at James Gunn humor. Couple different things to talk about in there. I'm a big Thor Ragnarok fan. A Jobs movie is to entertain me.
What?
A Jobs movie is to entertain me.
And this movie makes me laugh. I think it does find a way to just kind of balance enough the wacky, wild humor while having this story about Thor discovering the real source of his power and his exploring its father's failures. It does all of that while being lighthearted. I think this one, I would disagree with the idea that those two are battling each other. I could certainly, given my feelings on Thor, Love and Thunder, I can see how someone could experience this movie that same way, of the way I feel about that movie. You would have that with Thor Ragnarok. So that makes sense to me, while I would wildly disagree with it. The thing I would very much agree with here is that Taika Waititi's humor feels like James Gunn light. I think there's a lot of Taika feels like the generic brand James Gunn on several levels. First off, even when the trailers first came out, there were similarities of like, this is like turning Thor into Guardians of the Galaxy, and then everyone's cracking jokes like in Guardians of the Galaxy, and emphasis on 70s rock soundtrack, much like James Gunn focus on the soundtrack. But all of it feels like the kind of dumber version of all of it. Like the humor's a little bit more lowbrow, Thor is a little bit dumber, and even like you look at Awesome Mix from all three of the Guardians movies, the three Awesome Mixes, and it feels like someone that has a deep knowledge of 70s, 80s, 90s, zeros music. Feels like a real mixtape. Someone that actually loves music, has a deep, vast knowledge. You get to Ragnarok. It is a hit song from the biggest hard rock band of the 70s, Led Zeppelin. You get to Love and Thunder, and it's like a greatest hits album of the most popular hard rock band of the 80s. There's none of the depth. It's not like clever. It doesn't feel like Taika Waititi has this vast knowledge of music. He knows the most popular band of the 70s and the most popular band of the 80s. And so superficially, it's kind of like James Gunn, but James Gunn light. And so I don't know. I think there's a lot of truth to that, but I think Ragnarok works. I really enjoy Ragnarok. Every time I rewatch it, it makes me laugh. Hey, real quick, there is a companion video to this over on Patreon with even more of my reactions to your hot MCU takes. You had so many. I was talking for a very long time, so it had to go off in a second video. Join at any level over on Patreon. You'll gain access to that video as well as all of the live streams, my weekly Ask Me Anything, as well as my weekly box office roundup show, and a bunch of other hundreds of other exclusive videos. The link is down below in the description. For as little as $2 per month, you can join and gain access to this video and all of the others. I think Iron Man 2008 is pretty overrated. It's good, but not outstanding.
Really?
Well, agree to disagree.
I would totally disagree with this one, both as someone that remembers the impact that the movie made when it first came out, as well as when I rewatched the MCU. There's something very refreshing about this movie, and its simplicity, its lack of the weight of the rest of the MCU. I have a bit of a theory that people that experienced Iron Man when it first came out have a very different take on the movie than people that joined the MCU 5, 6, 7, 8 years long. The MCU is now 15 years old. So the current target audience of MCU movies were born the year that Iron Man came out. They got into the MCU around like phase 3. Like Endgame was when Infinity was where they really start to be able to get engaged with this sort of thing. There's a whole generation that got into it the way that some of us got into it opening weekend, May 2008. That was them in 2018, 10 years later. I suspect that plays a whole lot into how you interpret that movie because you don't remember how big of a deal it was. And you were raised on these MCU movies that are bigger, they're crossovers, they're like they have a higher rate of jokes, something that we've already criticized in this video already. They have a very different vibe to them in a lot of ways than if you go back to that original one that's just about this dude and then it teases a bigger universe. If I were to place a bet, I would guess that you did not see Iron Man in the theater. You joined the MCU several years later. I could be totally wrong. Join me in the comment section. I will try and spot your comment if you can correct me on that. But I would guess there's a correlation between when you joined the MCU and how much you enjoy the first Iron Man. Had several comments along these lines. This is the one that stuck out to me. MCU Phase 4 is criminally underrated and overlooked. Maybe. People who didn't like it are either cynical or negative. That's the part where we got to fight about this one. If you loved Phase 4 and thought it was just as good as the other phases and loved that they took some chances and did TV shows, awesome. Fair enough. Make that argument. But to discredit and to write off everyone's criticisms, oh, you didn't like it, you're just negative. You didn't like it, you're just cynical. To write off other people's opinions as disingenuous or being motivated by some character flaw, I take seriously issue with that. That to me is, you get into this toxic positivity. And I felt like I've had a lot of toxic positivity coming at me the last year where I've been critical of like a lot of Star Wars or She-Hulk. And when I didn't like projects that other people liked, all of a sudden, there's people attacking me. You're just nitpicking. You're just cynical. You're just this. Doesn't matter that right after I was critical of Obi-Wan, I praised Andor. Doesn't matter that right after I was critical of She-Hulk, I praised Wakanda Forever. Doesn't matter that I was positive about other things in these franchises. There's people that as soon as I didn't like a thing they liked, they were looking for a character flaw in me. That the real reason I didn't like it was because... And it's not the reasons that many of us have raised about MCU put out too much quantity, and so the quality dropped. It's not that they lost some of their stars and they haven't found a good replacement yet. It's not that they didn't have a team-up movie or an event to kind of pull things together. It's none of it's not those criticisms we actually raised. It's not what we're actually saying. The real reason is you're just cynical. I take issue with the idea of trying to just dismiss what enormous numbers of people have been saying. I have so many conversations with people, in particular on my Patreon account, so many conversations with people where they say, I watched every single MCU movie up until Phase 4. I just can't keep up now. And whenever a movie's coming out, they're like, do you think I need to watch this and this before I watch this? Because they just can't keep up. And their excitement is dwindling. It's not because they're cynical. It's not because they're negative. It's because MCU isn't connecting with people the way it used to. And I just don't think that there's any value in ignoring people's actual things that they're saying in order to attribute your own explanation to their actions, their own motivation driving their actions. I think that's toxic positivity. It's awesome if you love it. Tell me why. If you disagree with my reasons that I'm stating, let's talk about that. But we don't need to come up with new explanations for why I was critical for something. critical of something. Phase 4 did not suck.
You suck. You suck.
People were just overly critical. I mean, I think suck, it might be an overstatement of the quality of Phase 4. There were a bunch of good things in Phase 4. I would certainly say that Phase 4 was the most inconsistent. And I think the highs were lower and less MCU based. Like No Way Home, I think, is a great Spider-Man experience, but I don't think it's like a great MCU film. It's an amazing thing for Spider-Man fans. And so it was the phase that got me least excited for the MCU. It's not because I'm overly critical. It's because I think that they tried to do too many things in too short of a period of time, took too many risks without having anything to kind of pull it together, without having something that kind of built the momentum or focus. Phase 1 was building towards the Avengers. Phase 2 started to introduce the Infinity Stones. Phase 3 was obviously building towards Thanos. Phase 4 just introduces so many different plot lines that don't even get followed up for years after. Like Eternals puts like a celestial in the middle of the oceans. It hasn't been mentioned in 2 years, and the rumors are it'll be followed up on like in Thunderbolts a year from now. So like they introduce something and it's not followed up for 3 years, and there's all of these different plot lines like that in Phase 4. Did it suck? I think that's an overstatement, but I think it definitely underwhelmed and hurt the momentum of the MCU. That's my reaction to your hot takes. Remember, there is a companion video to this over on Patreon with my reaction to even more of your flaming hot takes. And if this video is successful enough, perhaps this will just turn into a series. If you enjoyed this video, there's more like it. You can check those out right over there. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking.